Microsoft and Amazon are the tech giants of the Pacific Northwest. These two companies shape technology in Seattle, and Todd Bishop has been writing about them for over a decade. Todd is the co-founder of GeekWire, an online media company focused on technology in the Pacific Northwest. In this episode of Software Engineering Daily, Todd and I sit down to discuss the past and present of Microsoft and Amazon, and what it means for an engineering company to be good or evil, and also what it's like to do software journalism, which both of us have plenty of experience doing. But before we get to my conversation with Todd, a word from the sponsors who keep the lights on at Software Engineering Daily. As a software engineer, you have tremendous leverage in the employment market. Every company needs software engineers, and these companies are all competing for you, the engineer, a scarce resource. But as an individual engineer, you don't have much insight into this incredibly opaque market. That's where Hired.com comes in. Hired.com assigns you a talent advocate who works to understand your needs and works to find you the perfect job. Go to Hired.com/SEDaily to try out the platform today and get a $2,000 bonus if you find a job. The companies on Hired compete for you, the engineer, and they make bids to win your talent. These are companies like Facebook and Uber, companies that we know are on the cutting edge of engineering because they've come on Software Engineering Daily to talk about their tech stack. I've used Hired personally, and I've experienced firsthand the ease of finding a well-paid, enjoyable job. This was way better than replying to LinkedIn messages from uninformed recruiters, and it was also certainly better than using a job search engine. To find a great job and support Software Engineering Daily, go to hired.com/SEDaily and get a $2,000 bonus upon finding a job. Check it out. It would support the show. Now let's get on with the show. Todd Bishop is the co-founder of GeekWire, an online media company focused on technology in the Pacific Northwest. Todd, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Oh, it's great to be here, Jeff.
You've been covering Seattle technology companies since the early 2000s, and one of the biggest stories over that time period is the rise of Amazon in the shadow of Microsoft.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a distinctive point in time where there was a big engineering drain from Microsoft to Amazon?
You know, I don't know if it was one moment in time, but it certainly started to happen. I don't know. I would say maybe 2006, 2007, sort of in the build up to the Great Recession. I think you saw Amazon at that point had really recovered from the dot-com bust when a lot of people on Wall Street, for example, were saying, hey, this company may not even survive. They got through that in the 2000 timeframe, 1999, 2000. And after that, they got back on their feet. And then it started to become apparent that Amazon was more than just this website where you bought books. And that was the point, I think, where they started to hire more aggressively in engineering, and AWS emerged, and all those things started to coalesce to the point that Microsoft and other companies started to lose key engineers to Amazon. And it goes back and forth, though. It's funny. You sort of see a trade-off. Some people will go to Amazon, then go back to Microsoft, and it's sort of there's sort of a pipeline back and forth between the two companies.
Yeah, and what is the narrative that you hear when you talk to people that are involved in engineering at these two different companies? How do you see the cultures of those two companies contrasted, and how has that contrast evolved over time?
I think you have to look back to Microsoft's heritage in packaged software and the whole notion that Microsoft comes from a place where they shipped one version of Windows every 3 years. And now Microsoft has gotten away from that. It's been a difficult path for them, but they've been able to get to the point where they now ship regularly, and they have incubation projects where apps are built that might have nothing to do with Windows. They might be for Android. So Microsoft's a very different place, but I think that type of approach is in Amazon's DNA, whereas Microsoft has had to manufacture it a bit and become a company that can ship on internet time. Amazon has always done that, and things like AWS grew out of Amazon's need to really fuel its e-commerce platform and make sure that it could scale. And then they said, wait a second, this technology we just built for ourselves, man, other people could use this.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think those are, to me, are the big differences in the culture in terms of the engineering. And we can get into this if you want. It's fascinating to cover them as a reporter, because I started covering Microsoft specifically at the Seattle PI newspaper back in 2002, 2003, roughly that time frame. And people would say, man, you're never going to crack Microsoft. You're never going to get inside that company and figure out what's actually going on. And I would say that about Amazon now. Amazon has taken that mantle. They are just they're a difficult company to get information out of. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's exciting as a reporter, because that means I have to use all of my resources and develop my own sources and figure out what's going on there on my own. And that's the ultimate challenge. Reporters live for that, and it's a lot of fun.
Fascinating. So I'm curious as a human being, but I'm also curious as a journalist, what are some of those tactics, the back channeling type of tactics to get information that is clandestine?
Yeah. So I'll give you a great example. The New York Times story came out last year, and they did a great job of getting lots of good sources. You could question. This
is the culture story. Yeah. The story of Amazon being a sweatshop, intellectual sweatshop.
Right. The whole idea of people crying at their desks. And, you could question the validity of their anecdotes and whether those anecdotes actually are things that are representative of the broader whole. I think Amazon it's a very difficult company to characterize in generalities, because I think for employees there in particular, your experience will vary widely depending on where you are in the organization, who you're working for, who your manager is. Mm-hmm. At any rate, that New York Times story came out, and we asked ourselves, so wait a second, there's a lot of anecdotes in this story, in the New York Times story. What do Amazon employees really complain about? So a couple of the reporters here, my colleague John Cook and a reporter who was here at the time named Jacob Demet, decided to make a public records request to the Department of Labor and Industries. And they asked in this public records request for any complaint that had been filed against Amazon with L&I over anything by an employee. And we got the documents back, and in looking through them, it became apparent that the biggest complaint, the number one complaint of Amazon employees in the sample that we got, was that there were not enough men's bathrooms for all the dudes who work there. So essentially, people there have to go from floor to floor in some of the Amazon buildings looking for open stalls, open bathrooms.
I had to do that when I worked at Amazon.
Yeah.
I remember having to do that.
So it's actually, in some cases, I don't know if it caused health problems for people that they had to hold it for so long, but I bring this up for a couple of reasons. First off, it's, I think, emblematic of a few different things. So the gender diversity problem that the world of engineering has. And it's also an example of us trying to rely and really attempting to rely on our traditional journalism roots to go for the documents that can tell the story, not just the people or the press releases. You have to, at our best, and we don't always achieve this, but at our best, we're going beyond just what's coming out of the companies and actually finding things that others are saying about the companies or that the employees are saying. And so that really, to answer your question, circling all the way back, is the thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to get a comprehensive view of whatever subject we're covering by not just listening to the person or the company we're covering, but getting all sorts of other things around them that really indicate what's going on.
That Amazon story, the one of the interesting things that I heard come out, I heard in the froth of the press discussion about that piece, and which continues to this day, was this idea that there seems to be a growing narrative between traditional media outlets against giant tech companies. Is that inaccurate, or do you think that that's true?
I think it can happen. I think it depends on the circumstance. It's difficult to make a trend out of it, or to see a trend there. I'm not sure. That's a really good question. I wonder if here's where I see things like the New York Times or the Washington Post, which Jeff Bezos owns. I really do think that they have an opportunity to be the example of what journalism can still do. And in many times they do that. They hold the mantle, and they are great examples of what a lot of the online sites should be doing. And so in that way, I think that the sheer effort that the New York Times put into that piece on Amazon's bruising workplace has to be commended. And whether or not you agree with the conclusions they drew, and I know that opinions on that are actually all over the map. Mm-hmm. It was actually a very divisive story, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It raised the issue and allowed people to debate it. Whether there's a phenomenon going on where it's those big media companies versus the tech companies, I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Well, one point that kind of stuck in my craw was the lack of a recognition that perhaps in order to build things as world-changing as AWS, you have to put your nose to the grindstone. You have to do this sort of bruising, sweaty, difficult, painful work. If I recall, there was almost no mention of that, no attribution to the fact that, AWS arguably led to Web 2.0. Certainly was a huge precipitating factor. But anyway, we could regurgitate, tech media discussions for the entire podcast. But this is Software Engineering Daily. I want to talk about some software engineering related topics. And the first one, I want to talk about Microsoft, because you've been covering Microsoft for a long time. You've lived in Seattle for a long time, and the Microsoft antitrust case is ultimately a case around engineering, and it's something that I was not around for. I wasn't involved in software engineering at all at that time, and so to what degree do you understand what happened with the Microsoft antitrust case, and what is your personal verdict on whether Microsoft actually did anything nefarious?
I covered the tail end of it, so the case, I'm trying to remember the exact timing, but when I came in, it was the aftermath. It was a lot of the lawsuits with the individual states, and then a lot of Microsoft's compliance with the settlement. A couple observations there. I do think that Microsoft felt it's hard to attribute intent, but I think there certainly are people inside Microsoft, leaders who were there at the time, who felt they were doing the right thing by making sure, for example, that Windows was, a strong application platform, and that people were writing applications for Windows. They felt like they were doing the best thing. And, you're dusting off my memory banks on this one. It's funny how quickly this one has faded. But the gist of the problem there was that Microsoft was creating, essentially trapping developers into writing for Windows. It was sort of what was the phrase that they used?
Embrace, extend,
and extinguish.
Or whatever.
Embrace, extend, and extinguish, and the whole idea that you had to build for Windows because the apps the users were there.
What does that mean? Embrace, extend, extinguish.
So that had to do with a lot of the tech standards. Boy, I'm probably going to get killed by some of your listeners who remember all this stuff better than I do. Seriously, it's funny. I actually do think that it became the settlement became irrelevant so quickly, and it speaks to the fact that technology just moved on past Microsoft in many ways on a lot of those fronts. With the rise of smartphones. I mean, to me, if you look back historically, Windows was dominant. It was 90% of the market. And the question really fundamentally was whether Microsoft was favoring its own applications over competing applications on Windows. And then also whether that then created this virtuous cycle. That's what it was, where you had app developers writing for Windows because it had the user base, and then the users were going to Windows because it had all the apps, and then it snowballed. It snowballed. And the thing that disrupted it was the rise of mobile computing, which Microsoft was not ready for. And so when you had the smartphones just come out of come out of the shadows and disrupt all that, suddenly, Android and iOS became in many ways the dominant client computing platforms for the people who would have otherwise maybe used Windows for those kinds of apps. Sorry, I know that's very muddled. But
No, not muddled at all. I mean, is there a macro conclusion to draw from that? Because the Supreme Court Department of Justice did find that Microsoft was a monopoly engaging in abusive business practices.
Yes.
I've got a quote from Wikipedia. Underlying these disputes were questions over whether Microsoft altered or manipulated its APIs to favor Internet Explorer over third-party web browsers.
That's right.
So it seems like they came to the conclusion that these APIs did favor Internet Explorer over third-party web browsers in what they anticipate would amount to a virtuous cycle. As you pointed out, it didn't end up really mattering that much because mobile disrupted everything. Is the larger macro lesson here that Department of Justice does not understand the nuances of technology in the business cycle and perhaps should well, I don't know. I mean, what is that?
That's a totally leading question.
Is it a leading?
Yeah, I think that our justice system in general, and even if you look at things like our regulatory system, like our patent system, I think it has a very hard time keeping up with the current pace of technology. I just covered a story this past week about Redfin winning a series of patents for web interfaces for home searching. And if you read the patents, it's like, yeah, well, no duh, this is what you should be doing. I mean, yeah, obviously you should be placing the homes on a satellite map and letting consumers browse around. And this is what they got the patent on just this past December. And they originally applied for it back in 2004. So, obviously the approval process at the patent office did not keep pace with the rest of the market. And so now the question is, can Redfin go back and extract licensing fees from Realtor.com and Zillow because they're showing homes on a map and letting consumers find available MLS data on a map? And so I do think that is a challenge for the government, for competitors who might want to stop monopolists in the future from capitalizing unfairly on their monopoly. And that really was, to your point, that was the problem with what Microsoft did back then, was it had 90% share on Windows, and then it leveraged that share to advantage its other products like Windows Media Player and Internet Explorer. That was the problem, now that it's coming back to me. And, I think what happens the next time, what happens when Oculus becomes dominant in virtual reality and it's favoring its own applications over those from third-party developers. Now, maybe you could argue maybe that wouldn't happen.
Here's the modern analog that I think about is the Facebook. What is it? Free Basics. The Free Basics thing. People are so worried that Free Basics is going to teach people in India that Facebook is the internet, and actually, many people are starting to believe that. But the question is, does it matter? Again, it's just like Department of Justice being afraid that people are going to be convinced that Internet Explorer is synonymous with web browser.
Right.
In 5 or 10 years, it's not going to matter. I mean, or
True.
Maybe it will, but who knows? And it's so hard to pass judgment. So, okay, putting that in question form, is the conversation around net neutrality when it comes to Free Basics. I mean, I don't know how much you've looked into the Free Basics case, but do you think this is overly wrought, overly negative, overly cynical?
I think it's something that regulators should look at and ask whether it's in the interest of consumers, in the interest of users, for companies to have those kinds of dominant positions, and whether the companies are using those dominant positions to their own advantage over those of the end users. I think certainly there's a role for regulators in that way to make those kinds of inquiries. Now, whether they're effective in stopping whatever behavior they find, I think that's a whole other issue entirely. But I don't think that there's anything wrong with them looking at it and trying to figure out if there's negative implications for end users.
Do you think are people too, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Self-righteous about net neutrality, or do people have too narrow a view of what net neutrality is or what it should be? Or I mean, like I heard Reed Hastings recently, like, he was fielding a question on net neutrality. Somebody asked him about net neutrality, and he was like, I think net neutrality is really important and it's really fundamental. And he didn't really like explain what is net neutrality? Give me a definition.
Yeah. I mean, it's the notion that all traffic on the internet is treated equally, right? And that the internet is sort of a public utility in many ways, and that you don't allow one type of content to move faster or more efficiently than another, or cheaper than another. I honestly, I read a lot about net neutrality, and I understand as much as I think I can on the issue, but it's one where I really, to me, the verdict is still out in a lot of ways. It's been really interesting to see what T-Mobile has done with Binge On, their video program, where they essentially treat video differently in that it doesn't count against your data caps. And they've gotten in some hot water over that because of the net neutrality implications. But for me as an end user, I love it. I'm a T-Mobile customer. There's not a lot that I love about T-Mobile, actually. But when they do these kinds of uncarrier moves, as they call them, where, if I'm watching Netflix on my iPhone, I can actually just go on LTE and watch it there, and it's not going to count against my data caps. Hey, that's nice as a T-Mobile customer. Now, you could argue that violates the principles of net neutrality because it's treating that type of content, that type of data differently than everything else. It's not charging for it. So I don't know. To me, it's a fascinating debate. I think I think it's important to keep an open mind to how it actually impacts all of us, and not just be adamantly opposed to anything that's not net neutral. That's where I am on it.
Yeah, and what confuses me is like there are people who they'll be able to appreciate the nuances of like free markets. Like they'll be able to say, okay, yeah, there's situations where you should regulate the market, and then there are also situations where you should just completely deregulate it. Free markets are great, but some people who are able to understand the nuances of the free market, for example, will still be dogmatic when it comes to net neutrality.
Right.
To me, it seems like this is the same two sides of the same coin. Net neutrality is just another version of the market.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that might be a little bit more philosophical than I get into things. But,
all right.
But no, I appreciate it.
No. Totally makes sense. More broadly, like this idea of corporate evil. People have been accusing the Free Basics plan as being evil, as being this latent, nefarious plan for Facebook to rule the world. We hear the same thing, or we heard the same thing about Microsoft a long time ago.
And still, I mean, just this past week, Microsoft announced a plan to give away like $1 billion worth of Azure and Office 365 to nonprofits. It's obviously a philanthropic effort on its face, but then those nonprofits essentially become addicted to Microsoft services.
Right.
There's always these are businesses, and they have business interests. And in a lot of cases, even in situations where they're doing things that are altruistic on their face, there's a business motivation to it. I don't know if that's where you're headed.
Well, do we have a true definition of what evil is when it comes to a company? So like, for example, I think like if I was an engineer at Goldman Sachs in 2005 and I'm engineering something that keeps track of how much money I'm making off of synthetic CDOs, and at the time I'm thinking, wow, this is so great, creates a great market opportunity. It's fantastic for the bank. I am doing no wrong. In 2008, when the market collapses, in part due to the types of technologies that I was engineering, is that a judgment on me? Do I become evil? Like, what is the actual definition of evil here? Is there some sort of objective function that we can place?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say you have to go back to that person's original intent. Was their intent purely self-motivated, or did they feel like they were actually creating value beyond the value they were creating for themselves? In other words, were they contributing back to home buyers or whoever it might have been that were benefiting from, the roll-up of mortgages or whatever it might have been that led to the 2008 crash? That's probably the toughest question I've ever been asked. What is evil? What is evil? I don't know.
Well, so because I think as a journalist, in some ways you're like a confessor of these companies. You're a retrospective confessor. Like the company is essentially in the confession booth saying, "Oh, journalist, have I sinned?" And you get to pass that judgment. So you get to.
Do we though? I don't know. That's a really good question. I think boy, I tend to look at the role of a journalist in a few different ways, and I don't know whether it's passing judgment. I wonder. I think that certainly there is a role for that in journalism. In other words, people writing columns and bloggers and all those sorts of things. To me, journalism at its core is figuring out and digging up something that people don't generally know and conveying that in a way that gets across its meaning and its importance and why it matters. And if in the process of that you're providing facts that people as readers then use to pass judgment on the subjects of your stories, then that's certainly good. But whether it's my role as a journalist to pass that judgment myself, I don't know that that's true. And that might be a very traditional way of looking at reporting, actually. I think there are some people out there who would say, no, you need to take that next step and pass judgment yourself and share that as part of your stories. Yeah, and there certainly are times when we share our opinions, and that is one thing. My colleague John Cook and I came out of traditional newspapers, and we've certainly expanded beyond that. And there are times when we do write things from a more personal perspective, even if they do include reporting. But I still think that the best journalism is the journalism that finds the facts and lets the readers or the listeners or the viewers come to the conclusions. The opinions come to the opinions.
So you really try to subtract the bias.
Gosh, I'm sure, I'm sure there are times when we fall short of that, and I'm sure there are times when we specifically are opinionated. I wouldn't say biased, but we're opinionated. We come to things with a perspective. I'm trying to think of some good examples on this, and nothing is immediately popping to mind. But I do think it's important to start first with the facts and not start first with the opinion. And I do think that's where journalism can go off the rails, is where reporters can come in with predetermined conclusions and cherry pick the facts that support how they feel. I think you see that a lot in politics, for better and worse.
Engineers love automation, and Wealthfront automates your investing. As a software engineer, there are certain processes that you want to execute no matter what, like integration tests during a build. You wouldn't execute integration tests manually. You would use a continuous integration tool like CodeShip or Jenkins to automate your integration tests. Wealthfront is a tool to automate investing. Just like a continuous integration tool runs your tests automatically, Wealthfront can reinvest your dividends automatically and perform tax loss harvesting automatically. To get your first $15,000 managed by Wealthfront for free, go to wealthfront.com/SEDaily and get started with Wealthfront's layer of automation on top of your portfolio. Wealthfront.com/SE Daily. Check it out. It would support Software Engineering Daily, and you will get $15,000 managed for free if you sign up. Automate your investing. Get back to the things that you can't automate, like writing code. So, okay, getting back to this discussion of courts and companies that are in the news. We have one more supposedly evil and modern company that we're hearing from a lot lately, which is Uber. Do you think in 5 years, when Uber finally extinguishes Lyft, it already extinguished Sidecar, and the prices of an Uber drop even further, and perhaps the drivers start breaking even, or even losing money, or maybe getting thrown off the platform more aggressively, and if the public narrative against Uber gets even stronger, do you think we're going to see a court case against Uber?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think if there's any company, you mean like a regulatory court case against them? And now, of course, we're already seeing this, and to some extent at the local and I think the state level, but in terms of a national DOJ investigation into Uber and its market power and how it uses it, I think if there's any tech company out there right now, they are the most likely to face that kind of scrutiny. They're disrupting a traditional industry. They are acting in ways at times that can be questioned by competitors, outsiders, by their own not employees, by their own contractors, which is a whole other issue. Yes, absolutely. I think they are candidate number one for DOJ scrutiny in a lot of ways.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't follow the elections super closely, but somebody told me that one of the platforms I think Hillary Clinton is running on is the standardization of the gig economy. Is there any truth to that?
I haven't really followed that a ton well, but I know that has been something that she's talked about a lot, and it's been something that's been part of her campaign. So yeah, I do think that, frankly, that that society would benefit from more vision from our political leaders on this topic in general, and sort of politicians and governmental figures who understand what's going on. I think it's an important thing.
What's your take on that, the gig economy?
I think it can be empowering for people, and I think it can also be unempowering for people. It's really situational. I'm sure most folks out there do the same thing as I do. When you get into an Uber and it's somebody, and say you're in a good mood and they seem to be somebody approachable, I tend to strike up conversations. And it's amazing to me, you've kind of got two different camps. You've got the people who are using it to supplement their income. There was a guy I was talking to, he explained that he sold refurbished Macs on Craigslist. That was his job. And it wasn't quite enough to make ends meet. And so he had started doing Uber, and it worked out really well for him. And he was making enough money to supplement his income and really get overall the equivalent of a full-time job between that and his Mac repairs. And but then you see folks who are clearly this is their full-time job, and as a replacement for a taxi medallion, I don't know that it's as good for those drivers as it could be. So to me, in that way, the gig economy is nice in that people can patch together different jobs and roles and essentially assemble kind of a Lego career for themselves, where they're just picking the bricks they want. Whether it's healthy for the industry, I don't know. Yeah.
I was I have a friend I talk to sometimes. I do the same thing, by the way, and talk to the Uber drivers. What's the rest of your life?
I'm sure they hate that by the end. I mean, so many people asking them about themselves, but sometimes you get that feeling.
Maybe, I don't know. I have a list of questions that I always ask every Uber I get into, and how long have you been driving for Uber? How do you like it? What other jobs do you have? And then this, other stuff, but I swear it seems like every time I ask them, it's like, oh, I started 3 weeks ago, started 6 months ago. And it's like, So does that mean that they're rotating off people are getting rotated off the platform, or does it mean that there's just more and more Uber drivers?
Yeah.
And then like the stuff that they're doing in the rest of their life is always interesting. Like sometimes it's like, oh, I'm learning to be a software engineer.
Right.
I have a big data cluster running on an Amazon server at home, and once I get off work, I'm going to go back and work on that. It's like, what?
My favorite Uber driver ever was the guy who I had a very similar conversation with him, and he asked me what I did, and I said, I tend not to go into the details of being a tech reporter, but I said, I'm just generally in the tech industry, and he said, Are you an engineer? And I said, no. And he said, Are you sure? He said, do you know engineers? And he handed me his card. He was a recruiter. He was recruiting people, and he was purposefully driving around in the neighborhoods in South Lake Union.
That's crazy.
Because his main gig, to your point, was not Uber. He was a software recruiter. And this was his way of meeting engineers.
Did you ask him any more about that? Like, how successful is this deal sourcing?
He's apparently, so I guess he had sort of fallen into it. I guess he didn't, he did actually start as an Uber driver. And then I guess at one point he had a recruiting company person in his back seat, and they were talking about it, and he was saying, oh yeah, there's lots of engineers in my back seat. And I guess they put two and two together and said, man, the referral fees are really good if you can send folks our way. It was a very Seattle story.
Absolutely.
It's like only in Seattle would you run into, or perhaps Silicon Valley, I guess.
I get so many of these LinkedIn messages from recruiters looking for engineering talent, and it makes me wonder about the inner workings of how this recruiting world works. But
we should talk about that afterward, because you should be, yeah. This is a whole other conversation that I don't know you want to have on the show, but it's, let me just say this. GeekWire is an advertising-based business and sponsorship-based business. And one of the key drivers of interest from our sponsors and prospective sponsors is the ability to use our channels for advertising to reach engineers and to recruit.
Yeah, what kind of CPM you get on that?
So we don't. So that's actually a really good point, and I'm happy to talk about this. So we are not CPM based, and so for folks who aren't immersed in advertising, the traditional advertising model is you pay per impression, per 1,000 impression. The M is the 1,000, and for one reason or another, we started doing time-based sponsorships at the very beginning. So the rates we charge are indirectly influenced by our traffic over time. In other words, we can justify higher rates if our traffic grows, but we are not charging per click or per conversion. We're just saying, hey, this is generally what you can expect. This is who our audience is. And it's actually, from a journalism perspective, very good, because that means that we are not directly financially motivated by traffic. In other words, if in a given week we get 100,000 more page views or 1 million more page views, it doesn't matter on our bottom line. Now, over time, we want to see the trend go up.
Sure.
So it's actually much more, from our perspective, it leads to a much more healthy relationship between the editorial and the business sides, which we keep very separate.
Yeah. This is the same. We have the same kind of discussions around this on Software Engineering Daily when we're like thinking about how to do advertising, and it actually does help to be decoupled from the standardized ways that people do things. Like CPM has a very standardized vocabulary and rate that get charged around it, and if you have a less standardized thing like a time-based thing, then you have more room to negotiate.
That's true. That said, your ultimate reach with advertisers and sponsors is limited because, for example, if we were to talk to a New York ad agency and we were just to say, hey, no, we're not going to talk to you about CPM. We're just going to talk to you about the general audience that we reach and our weekly and monthly rates or annual rates for sponsorships, it's the conversation doesn't go far. So there is some display. I should just be really specific and accurate. There are some display ads, particularly network ads on GeekWire that are CPM, but it's not a big part of our business. We do a lot of events, which is a big part of our business, and event sponsorships, and then sponsorships and advertising on the site are a big part of the revenue model. So
this kind of brings us to topic around sponsored content. I mean, this is so far removed from software engineering at this point, but who cares?
If somebody made it this far.
No, I think there's plenty of people listening. Actually, I think there's some interest in episodes where I do deviate from software engineering topics because there's enough episodes about software engineering that we do.
And I'm not an engineer, so frankly, this is probably inevitable that we would go away from software engineering.
Well, okay, so the sponsored content thing, I've heard a number of podcasts and read some stuff about how BuzzFeed arranges their content versus their advertising office. So I guess a couple questions. One, how do you see the sponsored content landscape currently? How do you see it evolving, and what do you do to maintain that Chinese wall between advertising and content?
Yeah. You're sitting next to our wall, by the way. Oh. The ad guys are literally on the other side. Okay. The ad team is literally on the other side. So we are very conscious of it. I can speak only from our experience. So we are so careful. It's to the point where a lot of times our reporters won't know that a company they're writing about is a sponsor. It won't be on their mind. They won't. And we like that. We would prefer that they just operate in a vacuum and write the story that they're going to write no matter what. I've lost us at least 2 sponsors because of stories that I've written. Accurate, fair, tough stories that they did not like.
Amazon and Microsoft?
No, not Amazon and Microsoft. No. So, to me, that's a testament to the fact that we're doing our best to keep that wall there. There's we have a membership model, and there have been times when we've written stories that I know have lost us members, and I'm not thinking about it as I'm writing the story. I'm one of the co-founders of the company, so I'm aware of it afterward, and frankly, it's more a badge of pride that we're just doing what we should be doing journalistically, no matter what, and just betting as a business that over time, just the fact that we're doing quality journalism will ensure our survival, no matter if it loses us one-off deals, loses our ad team one-off deals. That said, there are 2 forms of content that we've been doing that are that get into the realm of sponsored content. And our philosophy is that as long as it's clearly labeled, as long as the reader understands what's going on, then you're good. So the first form is something akin to underwriting. And so a great example of that is Steve Singh, the CEO of Concur Technologies over in Bellevue. He has a family foundation. And at one point he talked to John Cook, my colleague, and said, hey, this story that you guys did about the bus that went around with all of the high school kids to the to speak to female CEOs about what makes them work. This kind of story, you guys need to do more of this kind of story. And John said to Steve, hey, you know something? Can you help us do more of that kind of story? And so Steve underwrites what we call the Impact series. And we have a reporter dedicated just to that. And the idea is to say, where are there examples of people using technology to do good? Not to do things in their own self-interest, but to do good. And we have a reporter named Lisa Stifler who writes one long, in-depth, well-reported story on that topic every single week. And so Steve, it's underwritten, it's sponsored. He helps to fund the reporting resources, but he's not involved in the actual decisions. He just was involved in the vision saying, hey, this is important. You guys need to do more of this. And here is some funding to make it happen. So that's number one. We call it underwriting. So it's editorial content that's supported by someone who's not involved in the editorial decisions.
Yeah.
Then you have actual sponsored content, and that is it's an ad. It's written by them. It is an advertorial. It's labeled at the top, sponsored post, and it's them writing it. So it's basically an ad in the form of an article, but clearly labeled as an ad.
Sure.
So those are the two things that we do. I think there's times when some publications do that latter form of content, the native advertising, as it's called, and it's not clear. It's not super clear to the reader that it's actually sponsored.
Yeah.
And so I think using words like sponsored and paid, and I think that's really clear. And there's some other vague terms that some sites can use that make it more difficult to see that. So that's where we are on it. Frankly, we're not as progressive, I guess is the right word. We don't push the envelope on that as a lot of other sites do. We're a little more conservative in terms of how we approach that. We'll let things play out and see what works for some other sites, and you could say maybe we're not being innovative enough, but frankly, we haven't gotten into this at all, but if you look at other sites similar to ours in Silicon Valley, their approach has been very different than ours in terms of the way they built their business. We raised John and I raised a small funding round at the very beginning in 2010. Yeah, we're coming up on our 5-year anniversary. So it was actually 2011. March of 2011 is when we're founded. And Jonathan Spizzato, who is known by many folks in the Seattle startup community, he's our angel investor. He's our chairman. We raised a small funding round from him at the beginning. Our joke was we raised just enough money for John and I to run the company into the ground over 2 years. And fortunately, that didn't happen. And so from that point, we've bootstrapped our growth. And basically, when the business has done well enough, we've expanded. And we have not raised any additional funding beyond that initial very modest seed round.
Yeah.
And I think that contrast that with an approach where a company goes out and raises $30 million in VC, and then leverages that.
Sure.
I mean, I think that creates a very different mentality where you're going out and you're doing things that are actually not in the interest of your business. And I'm just speaking from a media perspective. If I had to report every quarter to VC, gosh, I don't know. It would put a person in a very difficult and a very different position, and put undue pressure on that person to show growth and profits, or just growth, frankly, growth in users and revenue that matched the ambitions and the ultimate desire for the investor's exit.
So do you feel the need to grow aggressively, nipping at your heels, or is it more a constant desire to improve journalistic intent? Because it sounds like those two things are not necessarily one and the same goal.
Yeah. Our hope is that if we do really good journalism, if we serve the community well through our events, that the business will follow. And let me be clear. I mean, so the way John and I split our roles, we're both doing some reporting, and I've been doing a little bit more recently than I have over the past 6 months. I've been trying to get back into it a little bit. But John is much more in the business development and events. So he's really become proficient and expert in running events in a way that I just don't know. I don't know how to. I'm involved and I help, whereas I'm much more involved in the editorial and the operations. So that's sort of how we've split our two roles, and we still haven't figured out what to call each other. We still just say co-founder. But the whole idea is, we want to grow. We want to build a successful business, but we don't want to do that at the expense of our journalism or at the expense of the community. we wanted to all sort of lift up together.
Okay, so to begin to close off, I want to ask just kind of a question. This is like self-interest related. Like Software Engineering Daily, we're trying to figure out like how do we think about scaling or growing or moving into different verticals. And there's so many options, and it's hard to determine what is a distraction, what is something that you should just bear down on, put all your energy into. How did you sort through that? And what were the things that really gave you ROI? Not just in terms of money, but in terms of like what felt like was growing the business and the organization in a direction that you wanted to. I mean, you've got at this point, podcasts, written content, conferences, other ancillary things.
A job board, memberships.
Sure. So we've got a podcast.
We've got
that's it.
We've got a healthcare program.
Okay.
It's tied to our membership program. So I don't think that we necessarily practice what I'm about to preach. So there is something to be said, though, for creating a bunch of different diverse revenue sources as a startup. And our main two sources of revenue are the events business and the online advertising. Those are the primary two. And the events business is divided up into sponsorships and ticket sales. It's hard to be prescriptive in a vague way on this. I can tell you what I think you should do. Do you want to know?
Yeah, please.
I think you've got to run events. I think you've got to expand into. And if I were you, I would start with very casual meetups. I don't know if you've started it. I mean, we haven't done any events. I would love to see the crowd that showed up at the first Software Engineering Daily meetup. You've got this great T-shirt that you're wearing. You could give out a bunch.
That's true.
I love the shirt.
We gave out. Thank you. The producer Pranay Mohan designed it, and I did give out some at QCon recently. We'll be giving out more at upcoming O'Reilly events.
Yeah, I love it because it's your aesthetic. It's simple. I love it.
It's almost generic.
Yes, but it's unique in its genericness.
Right.
No, seriously. I think that would be a first step. I would love to see. Frankly, you'd be competing with us in some regards, but who cares? There's tons of people out there and tons of events to go to, and I think it would be fantastic. And nothing drives home the size and the power of the audience that you've built more than seeing everybody in person.
Interesting.
I mean, it's such an online world that it's actually extremely powerful to go back to basics in some respects and just meet in person and get everybody together. So, and then, there's a whole business to be, I'm probably going to be scaring away all your attendees because they think they're going to be turned into a commodity for your future business ambitions. But
they're already a commodity. Listeners have no illusions.
That's right.
I'm only in it for the money.
No, come on. That's not true. That's not true. So at any rate, to me, that makes tons and tons of sense. I still do think you should do more written content.
Look, I love producing the written content. I love writing, but oh my goodness, does it take time to write a good piece?
It does.
Okay, well, that seems like a great place to stop. Todd.
Now that I've given you really bad business advice.
No, I think it's great. It's great business advice. As soon as we get off the air, I'm going to ask you about an accountant. Todd, thanks for coming on to Software Engineering Daily. It's always a pleasure. You and your team's advice has been extremely influential and helpful on the journey to making Software Engineering Daily something that runs on its own fumes. So thank you so much.
Anytime, Jeff.
Okay, great. Cool. This was great. How do I stop this?
Just hit the stop. Good. And then I'll stop and export right now. So